Welcome to a Friday Fireside Chat. I am Rita McGrath. You probably knew that if you're here. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. We do run the chat. If we don't get to your questions or comments in real time, I'll copy them and we'll try to follow up with them afterwards. And this is being recorded. So the recording will be available in a few days once we clean it up and do all that sort of thing. It'll be available on YouTube. So if you don't catch us live, you can catch us later on. I am just thrilled to finally be meeting someone I've wanted to talk to for a long, long time, Freada Kapor Klein, who is the co-author with her husband, Mitch Klein, of this great book called Closing the Equity Gap. And, everybody likes to mouth platitudes about, giving opportunity to people and creating pathways to success. But Freada and her husband have actually done it. And in this book, which is fascinating, I totally can recommend it. She really takes you behind the scenes and shows how the sausage is made, how you can actually give people opportunities. And it's just a wonderful, wonderful story. So Freada, welcome.
Well, I'm so delighted to meet you and to talk with you. Your ideas have been so influential, and I think they really intersect in a terrific way with the ideas in our book.
I think so too. I think so too. We're definitely singing from it's the same hymnal. So as we're getting started, maybe talk a little bit about your history, which is fascinating. I mean, going all the way back to the women's movement, and I was actually talking to a friend of yours, Stephen Forte, this morning, and he said, "Oh yeah, when the revolution comes, Frieda's going to be the first one over the bridge with a pitchfork." I thought that was a great compliment.
Well, maybe I've mellowed over the decades, and maybe not. Different strategies for different eras, right? So very, very briefly, I have always had a sort of passion for fairness, for people being treated fairly, and deep empathy for ways in which unfair biases, barriers are put in the paths of some people. And that comes from my own family experience. I think most of us, it's our own lived experience. And we talk about that a lot in the book, about how our entrepreneurs' lived experience fuels their passion for the businesses they create. So mine was really about experiences our family had of exclusion, actually, of being forced out of countries, of having relatives murdered. And I really, in my heart of hearts, starting from a young age, have always believed none of us are free until all of us are free. And I think all of us can do a lot more to build bridges, to empathize, because in different countries, in different societies, in different decades, different people are scapegoated. And someday it'll be our turn. And so let's all make sure we've got each other's back.
I love that. I love that. And the idea of really building equitable organizations. So I'll fill in the lines a little bit. So your husband was fortunate to have been in kind of at the very early stages of, what would it be, internet 0.05. But I mean, before we had the internet, we sort of had home computers, remember? And was in the inside track of one of those, which became unprecedentedly successful. And that then gave you the freedom to be able to actually start a fund investing in companies. Is that right?
Yes, over time. I had started on the kind of nonprofit track. I actually co-founded the first group on sexual harassment in the US in 1976. That's what got me very interested in organizational development and organizational culture and designing good businesses. And coming straight out of my PhD program, I was early at Lotus, the software company. And that's where I fell in love with, got the startup bug, fell in love with tech culture. I had learned to code in graduate school, but just loved startup life. And that began that trajectory that then turned into Kapor Capital.
It's just a great story. And so one of the things that you talk about right in the beginning, it's an impact investment fund. And the thesis is closing the gap between the haves and have-nots. And throughout the book, you really talk about this thesis of gap closing. And I think in a very nuanced way, right? You point out that there are some gaps, like it's kind of gray area. And then there's some that are pretty clear. And you, I guess, persuaded Mitch to invest $10 million a year for 10 years in people And there's a stunning statistic you talk about right at the beginning of the book, which I have lived because I've been part of so many of these programs, which is $6 to $8 billion every year wasted on DE&I efforts. And I've seen it, the performative DEI theater, let's do anti implicit bias training, right? And we all know it leaves you worse off than you were before you started, right?
Exactly.
And so you really came up with this idea of something radically different. So maybe explain the thesis behind it and how you codified it in your investing philosophy.
Well, we decided that it's very important to leverage capitalism in the best possible way, to leverage private markets for solutions to large-scale intractable problems. And not everything can be solved by private markets, but there's an awful lot that has not yet been attempted that I think can. And I think there's a lot of potential in public-private partnerships. And many of our startups are actually working with government at different levels, cities, states, federal. But what we came up with is to look at tech startups. So it has to be tech-driven because the only way you get to scale is technology. And so if you want to have a big business, if you want to have a big impact, it has to be tech-driven. So these are all early-stage tech companies whose core business, the products or services that they create, have to close gaps of access or opportunity or outcome for low-income communities or communities of color or otherwise be involved in gap closing. Some of these things actually look like democratization of access to things that previously were only accessible to wealthy people and therefore were gap widening. But it turns out there is no shortage of companies. We see about 3,000 deals a year.
Whoa.
And invest in, a dozen to 20. And, there's probably easily 10x that number that fit our criteria and that would be good investments. So there's plenty of room for lots of people, and we would really like other people to come adopt this philosophy. Because I should also point out, a decade into 100% gap closing companies, we were top quartile and have been consistently top quartile financial returns, meaning we are beating the financial results of 75% of all the other venture capital firms of our same size and vintage, regardless of whether they've got a diversity lens or an impact lens, or even those firms that are just looking for financial returns, we're still beating them.
I love that. And it feeds so beautifully into so much of the conversation on, in the large company world, right? Should companies be run for the benefit of their shareholders? And what a growing mountain of research is showing is that companies that do indeed adopt these more inclusive, more opportunity-friendly, across the board sort of structures are actually better financial performers. A great example of that is you may be familiar with KKR and their investment in CHI overhead doors. When they made hourly workers owners, and when they had an exit event, they sold off to Nucor Steel. These guys, it was game-changing amounts of equity. And I love your approach because it's so hard for people that are not part of the club to get any kind of equity, any kind of meaningful equity.
Exactly. So this is definitely a wealth building strategy for those who are, first generation college goers or immigrants or people from low income backgrounds. They can change the trajectory of their lives, their families, and their communities. And what we love is when our entrepreneurs use their own lived experience to identify a problem and then to identify that solution, not just for themselves or their families, but for their whole communities, and completely transform millions of people's lives.
Well, and one of the great examples in the book is the case of Fresno.
Bitwise Industries.
Yes, that's right. I was just looking for the name, Bitwise Industries. Maybe could you tell that story? Because I think it's wonderful. I mean, these were people who came from a very disadvantaged upbringing, got out, right?
Yes.
And this is what I think the story is so interesting. And then came back with the resolve that they weren't going to abandon this place. They were instead going to invest in it and make it better.
Exactly right. This is the story of Jake and Irma, two people who grew up in Fresno, who left for college and graduate school. In Jake's case, he's a lawyer by training. Irma, sort of fourth generation farm worker family, sort of went to college by accident and became an engineer by accident. She actually tells a story about, she got college brochures and couldn't afford to do a college tour, but picked a college in Toledo, of all places, because, and picked her engineering major because she liked the look of the building. And, she's just a very talented engineer, but it's just these accidental paths when we don't have role models, when we don't have good public education, when we don't have good pathways. And Irma had to go sell bottles and cans for the nickel each to afford her Greyhound bus ticket from Fresno to Toledo. And so now she's sitting on top of a company that she co-founded with Jake. Bitwise Industries is now in 10 cities. They've got 1,000 employees. A couple months ago, we co-led their $80 million latest funding round. And what they do is, at its core, gap closing. So they create apprenticeships, tech apprenticeships in what they call underestimated cities. So they started in Fresno, their hometown. They buy distressed real estate and fix it up, and it becomes their classrooms. It also becomes space for their graduates to do startups. It becomes space for the local businesses to put in a new coffee shop to feed the students. But they are paid apprenticeships. So they take people from retail or factory jobs making minimum wage. They go through 6 months, let's say, of full-time paid apprenticeship training. If they need transportation because they haven't been able to afford a car, Bitwise provides transportation to the apprenticeship. If they can't go there because they're a single parent and they need childcare, Bitwise provides that childcare. If their family is food insecure, Bitwise will help. What they've recognized is that what's in the way of many people upskilling is not a lack of talent, nor is it a lack of drive or ambition. It is that daily life gets in the way. So they've removed those daily life barriers. They've transformed the economy of Fresno. A local realtor said that the majority of new home purchases in Fresno were Bitwise employees and apprenticeships. Stunning, right? And so they thought, well, maybe it's just because they had a home court advantage. They went on and repeated in Bakersfield, Merced, and Oakland, all California cities, all of those being successful. And then they went outside. They went to, the spot of Irma's alma mater, to Toledo. They're in Buffalo. They're in Greeley, Colorado. They're in Las Cruces, New Mexico. They're in El Paso, Texas. And they're just expanding to the south side of Chicago. And it's just a remarkable and heartwarming story, because everybody's lives are transformed in this process.
Now, how did they make money?
They make money because they hire about half of their apprentices, and they have a very robust consulting service, so that they provide a huge proportion of Salesforce administrators, for instance. They train their apprentices in cybersecurity, Salesforce administration, DocuSign administration, and then those folks go out into jobs, but half of them stay in the consulting business. And so they routinely are awarded, because they have the best talent and the lowest cost, huge national contracts or international contracts with large Fortune 500 companies, with the US government, with state and local governments. They just have this army of tech talent to throw at any number of real problems.
That is fascinating. One of the other observations I would make, and I've done somewhat accidentally a lot of work in this sort of space is if you take somebody who's from a disadvantaged background, right, kind of pound for pound, other things being equal, they're just better than somebody who had all the advantages because they had to be.
Exactly.
And so people really don't understand the talent that's sort of locked up there.
Exactly. And we talk, and in the book, we talk a lot about distance traveled. And it's something I learned from co-founding an undergraduate scholarship program about 20 years ago, and then going on and founding a college access program in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, for low-income high school students, half girls from day one. And I learned this notion of distance traveled being such a better predictor of talent than pedigrees. And I think it's exactly what you're talking about in terms of why they do so much better. It is they've demonstrated a remarkable persistence and resilience and determination through unimaginable hardships that they don't even talk about. And so what I learned from our scholarship students, it was just a fact of daily life for some of them that every day they chose, am I going to have lunch today and walk 3 miles home? Or am I going to skip lunch and be very hungry? And instead, I can pay for the bus home. And if that's your daily life, you develop all kinds of coping skills and strategic skills and decision-making skills and a long-term view of ambition, who you are, who you want to be, how you're going to get there. That I think is just, we don't have a way to capture. Certainly resumes and LinkedIn profiles and the algorithms we use for hiring, they don't capture that distance traveled. And I think we could benefit as a society, as employers, as higher education, if we put that distance traveled metric into how we look at candidates, whether it's for education or for employment.
Well, I've been saying for a long time that once you could actually measure capability or skill at the level of the capability or skill, now all of a sudden, all these other things that are really just signaling systems, right? So the fact that you have a degree and what kind of school did it come from? And what an employer really wants to know is, what is it you're capable of doing, right? I mean, if we cut right to the end of this, what are you capable of doing? And we don't really, at the moment anyway, have great ways of determining that. But I think we're starting to see early evidence that, and some of your programs, I think, fall right into this, early evidence that that's a great way of fixing things. One of the other, and you don't talk about it a lot in the book, but one of the things I found super interesting, and it's on page 34, where there's an executive order that the government agencies are going to bring challenges to tech. So rather than designing the solution and then telling tech companies to bid on whatever it was some bureaucrat came up with, was sort of say, here's the problem, tech. You guys. And I never thought about it that way before, but when you think about it, most of government procurement is kind of backwards because, you've got some person thinking up a solution in a vacuum.
Completely. And given the pace of technology these days, government, by definition, is going to lag technology. And so it's always, and we see this right now with AI, we see government running after, trying to figure out what is it and how do we put up the guardrails? How do we rein it in? And aren't we better off putting the right people in the room and saying, can you bring your entrepreneurial chops? Can you bring your vision of the future? Can you bring your lived experience and help us design a solution, and a fair solution, and one with guardrails to these intractable problems?
I just thought that was it's a small point you make in the book, but I thought, wow, that totally changes the game. So another way in which our work kind of dovetails, so the education piece is definitely one, but another is this whole way of thinking like an entrepreneur. And I codified part of it years ago in this concept called discovery-driven thinking, discovery-driven planning, which is rather than, you throw a pile of money at something and you create a big team and you assume you know what's going on. You say, wait, let's test out some of our hypotheses first. And, good entrepreneurs have always operated that way. But I think for big company people, this comes as a real shock because what big companies want to do is see big results really fast, and they think it can be solved by throwing money and people at the problem. So I just saw the other day a big announcement from some firm that's heading off in some big direction that's unlikely to be successful. But and so what they do is they create these big teams. They fund it completely. They have this 18-month-long quantification of fantasy wrapped up in a spreadsheet. And so they get 3 months in, half the team now completely knows this is the wrong direction. This is not going to get us where we want to go. And yet now it's like we've got this freight train of stuff going forward. And so we don't speak up, we don't change course, we don't say to our leader, mudslide that way, like we don't want to do that. It doesn't. And so you end up, 18 months or however it takes before the thing finally implodes of its own weight, before it just goes over a cliff. But I think you brought that really entrepreneurial sensibility. And this is where I think the magic happens to these social issues. What I hear, in the capitalist circles I travel in is, you'll never make money doing good, not for profits. That's the way to do that. And you're kind of looking at it going, actually, no, there's really massive amounts of untapped opportunity here. So how did you get to that insight? Or maybe that was just so natural to you, you don't even remember.
Well, it's been evolutionary, but I do want to back up a moment and give you credit for this whole notion. My dog came to visit, is discovery planning, because many people have now talked about it in more recent decades. But you really nailed it first. And it's what we talk a lot about customer development these days. All your ideas about checking assumptions, that's really what a great entrepreneur does. It's about iterating. It's about pivoting when they need to pivot. All of those, buzzwords we have today are rooted in something that you identified decades ago. So kudos.
Oh, thank you very much.
And we see this in our best entrepreneurs. They see a problem. It comes from their lived experience. They're passionate about solving it. One of the other stories that we tell in the book is of an entrepreneur by the name of Phaedra Ellis Lampkins, who started a company called Promise Pay, also doing extraordinarily well. And Phaedra had this searing experience as a child. She grew up in a low-income family, and she went to a school with lots of other low-income kids and eligible for free and reduced lunch. At her school, though, her public school, she had to go stand in a separate lunch line. This, it's sort of like putting a, big scarlet letter on your forehead. I'm from a poor family. And what I like to say when I go speak to business executives and venture capitalists, and I say, okay, show of hands, how many of you chose your parents? How many of you chose the family you were born into? Well, that would be exactly none of us. And so let's not get too smug about whether we had money for lunch in elementary school or not, because we had nothing to do with whether we had that money in our pocket. So this was a really life-changing experience for Phaedra. And she dedicated her life to treating low-income people with respect and dignity and helping figure out solutions. So what Promise Pay does is helps people stay current or get current on their utilities and their water bills. And so people choose, it's all off of a phone. You don't have to upload documents when you don't have Wi-Fi and a laptop and all of that. And you choose your payment amount, you choose your payment date, and it's no fees, no interest. And in all of these pilot cities like Louisville, Kentucky, or LA County, they were shocked. They're used to turning these things over to these big threatening bill collectors, and they might see 10 cents on the dollar. So 95% of people, when treated with respect and dignity, given some choice about how much they pay and when, 95% of people paid their bills. Mm-hmm. This was money that the municipalities never thought they would see. Mm-hmm. So she's expanding the number of paying options, and she started in cities, whole states. The whole state of Virginia just signed up for Promise Pay. And she sends me the tapes off of their customer support lines now and then, and they're customers that are just sobbing about thanking her. No one's ever treated me like this. Thanking her and her team for helping them rebuild their credit scores. People want to pay their bills. People want to be good citizens and good neighbors and good community members. And we often just make it too hard for them to do so.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'm reminded of this with this whole, debate we're having now about you have to work to get benefits. And it's not that you have to work. It's that you have to navigate through pages and pages and pages of government reporting requirements. I mean, the two things are not the same. And I think we keep forgetting that.
That's right. Because what we've seen, whether it's, with Bitwise, then if you just get those hurdles out of their way, so many people just clamor for the opportunity to learn new skills, to double their income and help their families. Absolutely. And we just make it too difficult. We need their talent.
We really do. We really do. And, the sad state that late stage capitalism is in at the moment, and that's a whole nother conversation. But every so often I run across a book like yours or a story like yours, and it gives me hope. There are actually ways that we can bend this arc a bit. And I think you really demonstrated that was true. One of the phrases in the book that I love is that it's something about talent is not allocated by zip code, but opportunity and access is. And I thought that was so profound. So one of the stories I hadn't, I sort of knew it from like 4 arms lengths, the Uber story, and like anybody, of course, Uber has had a big impact. And you were one of the almost accidental early investors in Uber. So maybe tell that story. I think people would find that really fascinating.
Well, it was a bit accidental. And that's my husband, Mitch, who had, designed the 1, 2, 3 spreadsheet and was the founder of Lotus. And he had known the founder of Uber, Garrett Camp, and Garrett was there before Travis. Travis was
everybody thinks it was Travis, right? And
exactly. And so Travis was one of those retroactive founders. But it was captivating in terms of the use of technology and in terms of how we saw it, although we invested prior to our having 100% gap closing investment thesis, but we also were well aware that there are many people who could not get a safe ride home based on the time of day that their shift ended, based on the neighborhood where they were working. And also there was a lot of data about taxi drivers. And, certainly I've experienced this in New York. You watch taxi drivers go past Black men who are trying to flag them. So we did see that possibility, as well as for Uber drivers. Uber, we always said Uber was a great second income. It was not designed to be a great first primary family supporting income. But so we became investors, angel investors, never had a board seat, but periodically some of one of Travis's direct reports, Emil, would call, there'd be some crisis, there'd be some culture problem. They were in this rapid growth that we'd been through, and they'd want advice and they'd want help. And I would spend hours. One of the amusing things is that Emil would call Mitch's phone and say, "Can I speak to your wife?" It's like, really? What decade is that from?
That's wonderful.
Yes. So it gave you a little glimpse of the culture right then and there. And I would spend hours coaching them through what they needed to do to intervene in this crisis, but what they needed to back up and redo about organizational culture and practices and policies. And they would implement some of the intervention techniques and none of the other stuff, nothing that would prevent the next crisis. So this was a recurring theme. And so at the point when Susan Fowler's blog dropped about what an awful year she had had as an engineer at Uber, we said, look, we have to speak out. We have tried as hard as we can try to give them advice behind the scenes, be accessible. I had gone into the company at the invitation of one of the women engineering groups. And it just was, it was the tsunami of their culture. just couldn't be fixed with these little tweaks. So we wrote a public letter to the board, to the other investors, and it had an impact. And part of the impact, the rest of the venture capital community thought we had overstepped. You're supposed to be endlessly loyal to your founders. And we believe you're supposed to be endlessly loyal to good principles and practices and values, not endlessly loyal to actors who become bad actors.
That's tough. And I think one of the phrases that you had used against you was that Kapor Capital will turn on you.
Yes,
the way they turned on the people at Uber,
right.
and that simple phrase says an awful lot.
Well, it says a lot about what an insular and clubby environment venture capital is, and that being in the club is more important than doing the right thing. So
interestingly, I just wrote a piece about Uber's current CEO, Dara, and did something that I cannot imagine Travis ever doing, which is he bought a secondhand Tesla, as one does, but took a stint as an Uber driver, and used that experience to actually improve just the lives and the kind of make it easier and better to be an Uber driver. And the consequences for Lyft have been pretty dramatic. I mean, they've just announced major downsizing and restructuring and everything. And so, it took a long time to get to it, but like treating people well actually does have a payoff.
Exactly. Well, and again, the customer-driven approach, talking to drivers are as much a part of the equation. Anybody who's taken an Uber or a Lyft or a taxi for that matter, your experience as a rider has everything to do with the driver, not with who's the CEO. And Dara has been great. Dara invited us to come in and, understood that we never talked about whether he agreed or didn't agree with us speaking up, but he really wanted our advice on fixing the company. He understood he inherited a huge number of problems and a broken culture.
Yeah, I was surprised he took the job, to be honest. When it was finally announced, I was like, he had such a track record of, and I can't remember where his previous company was, but I remember he had done, what was it?
Expedia.
That's right. So he had this incredible world-changing, happy puppy kind of life and to step into.
Exactly.
Wow. You must have a backbone of titanium to be able to even contemplate that.
Well, he's done a remarkable job, and I think writers, drivers, investors all see the results.
Mm-hmm. And Lyft has not kept up, frankly.
Exactly.
So one of the other things about the book that I think is interesting is, of course, it's got its share of really great, heartwarming success stories, but you're also pretty upfront about some of the things that didn't go as you'd hoped. Some of the other investors who didn't share the same values and sort of turned the heads of the companies, the founders of the companies they were investing in, and companies that kind of lost their way. And I guess what I'm curious about is very few authors of business. I won't say it's a memoir because it's really not. It's more of a sort of a handbook for, hey, this can be done and you can do it too, which I love. I love that about the book. But there's always a tendency to always put down on paper the things that are good and the anecdotes. And one of my concerns with that, as somebody who tries to learn from business books and case studies, is you're never getting the whole story. Right. You're never getting the true tale. The history is rewritten by the victors, right? But I think you kind of avoid that in this book. You're sort of pretty honest about, here's a thing we tried and it really didn't work out the way that we hoped.
Mm-hmm. Well, we are entrepreneurs, and we took an entrepreneurial approach to a new venture capital firm. And so in that way, we also have a lot of empathy for the entrepreneurs that we fund and we are also very forgiving about failure. Because that is where you learn. Unfortunately, we learn so much more from failure than from success. Success has a certain degree of timing and luck that you can't control. Mm-hmm. And failure, you really can learn from and try to control those elements going forward. So we want to be completely transparent about the whole story. And we want others to adopt the approach. I think that there's a lot about the current investing world, the current world of venture capital, that is misguided, quite honestly. That I think having one and only metric, and that's financial success, has made many people make bad choices that hurt the entrepreneur. Entrepreneurs get thrown out by the mainstream Sandhill Road venture capitalists all the time if they're not making enough money fast enough.
Well, it's the speed thing and the scaling thing that has always worried me. I mean, it's totally antithetical to the discovery-driven growth idea, which is, walk before you run, crawl before you walk, figure out what the there is. And if it takes a few years, well, that's what it takes. And as long as it's not, as long as you can cover your bills and as long as you're not out on the street, that's okay, right? I mean, and there are many great leaders who know this, like Ed Catmull at Pixar. One of the things that he talks about is he said, if I've got a couple of designers, a producer, an engineer that want to spend 3 or 4 years thinking about a project, I'm cool with that. Let them get it right. And then we'll bring in the storyboard people and the illustrators and the programmers and the expensive stuff. But by the time I do that, I kind of know where I'm heading. I know what the shape of it is, right? And so a lot of these venture capital firms, these venture-backed firms, I've just been I've got a whole string of what were they thinking. So one that I've got in my sights right now, and this will appeal to you, is Chief, the women's organization. I just read somewhere that they've raised a Series B of $100 million for a women's networking organization. And I don't know what that business model could possibly be to scale it, right? And this is part of my frustration with the whole not-for-profit sector, which is, you want to stop, I'll make this up, teen pregnancy in New York City. Well, you've got one group that's doing it through cooking classes and another group that's doing it through Zumba and another group that's doing it through piano and another group that's doing it through sports. And at no point do we all sit back and say, okay, which of these things had the biggest impact? What metrics are we going to use? And wouldn't it be better if we really wanted to make an impact at scale if we all got together and did something in concert, right? And so I find the not-for-profit sector very frustrating for that. Whereas I do think this is something tech and venture have cracked, and you've talked about it earlier, which is, you're not going to try to make a social impact one person at a time. You're going to try to make a social impact with a model that can scale.
Exactly. Music to my ears. I completely share your frustration with nonprofits. The fact that they don't collaborate is just appalling to me, that they see each other as competitors when what we're trying to do is uplift human beings who are suffering. It's bizarre to me. But I think it also, I think, we look at connecting the dots here, and I look at big philanthropy. And big philanthropy has done a lot of good. And yet we also look at where they invest. Mm-hmm. And those $1 billion endowments are usually invested in things that cause the problems or exacerbate the problems that the grants are trying to fix. And so you've got a 95% versus 5%. So philanthropic organizations, foundations, give out 5%. That's their mandate. So if you've got 95% invested in, an easy example, in fossil fuels, and you're giving 5% to fix climate change, who's going to win? Let's talk about that scale. And that's an extreme example. But if you think about it, as you said, we do know what approaches work better than other approaches. And whether that is to food insecurity or to teen pregnancy or to intergenerational poverty, we've got some answers. And shouldn't foundations and universities, by the way, shouldn't those endowments be invested consistent with mission? Because we and many others have proven that to invest that way improves financial returns. It doesn't decrease them.
And how do you convince people of that? Because I hear it all the time. So hiring someone who's, say, from a minority group. Oh, do we have to drop standards? No. No, you do not. You can expect as much excellence from those people as you would anybody else. And it just makes me crazy. It's like, what logic are you following? I have a group that I work with, who I really adore, but they're like white guys who all went to places like Harvard and Tuck and University of Chicago. I mean, like they came out of a cookie cutter. Oh no, I'm sorry. We have one representative Asian woman and we've got one Indian guy. Okay, but the rest of them, they all look like they came out of the same baking tray. And so I said to them, well, like, you've been around a while now. Could we possibly consider bringing a little diversity in here? Oh, well, we're a meritocracy. We don't want to drop standards. And I'm like, what planet are you people? This is not 1952,
Right. Well, and our whole notion as if meritocracy is somehow objective. And if what you're doing, what we often confuse is pedigrees for talent. And that's what we've learned so much from our distance traveled metric, which is you can't substitute that you got a degree from this school. It doesn't signal anything except perhaps you privilege. And it was a former president of Princeton who said the single greatest predictor of an SAT score is family income.
Wow.
So, and so much, it used to be that, college admissions depended on that SAT score. So we're rewarding the wrong thing and we think of that as merit. And so, back to our conversation, how do we do a much better job of measuring the things that are directly connected to success or to skill or to talent or to integrity and character for that matter?
So can you describe the metric? Do you have an actual metric that you use?
No, but when we talk about distance traveled and we look at the distance traveled of the entrepreneur, we look very specifically where they started in life and where they got to on their own steam, as opposed to those who were, got their pedigrees and things through accidents of birth. Mm-hmm. We look at that distance traveled completely connected to their own lived experience. So we look at when they come with a business plan, with a pitch, with a deck, we look at where did the idea for that come from? Was that part of their lived experience? Because we find that there's a level of understanding, there's a level of nuance, and there is a determination to make that solution succeed, and they will keep at it. They will keep trying different things. So these two interrelated notions of distance traveled and lived experience are what we try to operationalize when we are making investment decisions.
I love that. So how do you find your investment opportunities?
Well, they find us.
Okay.
I actually should say, and in the early years we went out to all of the demo days and made ourselves known with the accelerators and incubators out there, various programs. But one of the things, and a story about one of my partners, Brian Dixon, right after George Floyd was murdered, Brian wrote a Medium post in response to our firm being flooded with requests from mainstream venture capitalists saying, oh no, we've never invested in a Black entrepreneur. How do I find one? And it's sort of, it's your lowering the bar story. It is like, really? It's like, did they think we're going to tell them to go to a certain store and go to aisle 12?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you just put it in the
it's over there. You've been looking on aisle 6, wrong aisle. Anyway. So what Brian wrote, a very short, straightforward, start with your own firm. Look at who's sitting around your own investment decision-making table. And to their credit, two very well-regarded venture capital firms, first round on the East Coast, initialized on the West Coast, they read his post, they gave him credit, they posted their partner jobs, and each firm hired their first Black partner. Now, a notion as simple and quite honestly not revolutionary as posting a job, but just to see how it took being shaken up a bit, like, wait a second, you don't know the best talent. They're not already in your network. And if you open up this opportunity, you might find someone who brings a different lens and who will bring a different set of entrepreneurs. So the diversity at the Kapor Capital investment team table from the beginning across all dimensions, I think, is what is directly attributable to our attracting a huge range of talented entrepreneurs. We repeatedly hear from people who come to us, my round is oversubscribed, but I want values alignment on my cap table. So I'm holding room for you if you will come in. It's just so heartwarming. It's amazing that, we beat out these huge firms because the entrepreneur sees who we are, who we've backed, who's at our table.
That's amazing. So I know some of our listeners will be really interested. So you've identified someone, they've sort of got through the initial hurdle of they're closing a gap, it's lived experience, they've got a lot of miles traveled. What would be the next step?
In terms of investing?
Well, just in terms of how you would work with that.
So we do have a whole set of platform services. And so they're not alone. Very importantly, we go out of our way to not invest in competitors. And so, sometimes when you invest that early, your businesses grow and pivot over time, and they might encroach on each other's space. And we have a whole procedure for how we handle that. But we won't take a look at a company, no matter how enticing, if it's competitive with someone already in our portfolio. We are committed. Unlike most venture capital that says, only 1 in 10 survives, and that's who we're going to kill off the other 9. We want all 10 to survive if they're good businesses.
I was going to ask about that, because that is kind of antithetical to the more humane way you're talking about companies growing.
Exactly. And so some are going to be high growth, and some are going to be slow growth, and some are going to take several pivots, and that's okay. And we stick with them. And so we have people who help them hire. We have people who help them with their marketing, their digital marketing. We have a whole network of we have a founders group. It's just so heartwarming to see the questions that they pose for each other. And just last week, somebody said, I'm a first-time entrepreneur. I'm 6 years in. I'm about to do my first acquisition. Has anybody here done an acquisition? Can you help me? And people just jump in and say, oh, I did this, I did that. I've got somebody for you to talk to. I did 3 bad things. Don't do those things. And so it's a community, and we bring that community together in person, in real life, when there isn't a pandemic, as well as their ability to access each other. And so we are dedicated to helping them succeed. We help them think about, how do you build a diverse team and an inclusive culture? We offer workshops, we offer, consultants and talent to help them with their own growth issues.
Oh, that's just amazing. What I love about it is how comprehensive it is. And I have a lot of friends in the entrepreneurship world, and the joke about vulture capitalists and, the horror stories about what happens when something starts to become successful and everybody smells blood in the water, and, just making these decisions that are not good for the long-term health of the business. I mean, one of the other interesting things to me about the venture capital model, as it's, I guess, it started in the 50s and 60s and how it's evolved, is how the easy money of the last few years has resulted in a number of companies going through their growth, paying back their initial investors, and then they kind of limp their way onto the public markets. Casper might be an example, right? The original mattress in a box company, which was sort of an interesting idea. This is one of those ones where if you'd done a discovery-driven plan, somewhere in the early stages, someone would have asked the question, well, how many mattresses does a person buy in their lifetime?
Right.
Like, once I've sold a customer one, unless they're very wealthy and have a second home or something, and that's just not the market they were going after, the chances are you're going to buy one, and if it's any good, you're good, like, for a while.
Right. You're going to keep it for a very long time. And also, what are the barriers to entry of other people coming and doing that?
207 companies. By the time they went to IPO, 207 companies were competing in the mattress in a box business.
Right.
And it's just, you just look at it and you go, what were they thinking? But I think that's part of the dilemma that I saw when, even with 9 get killed off and 1 succeeds, even with that model, even if you buy that premise, which I agree with you, I don't think that's healthy. But even if you buy that premise, that stopped working, right? Because there was just so much money chasing so many ideas that I think we'll look back on and go, what were they thinking?
Right. Well, and the hard part, we had those conversations all the way along where someone would come in, we'd say, this valuation is nuts. You're going to have a really hard time growing into it and sustaining it. But if you want to stay in the game, some of those we said, we know this is headed for some rocky times, but we think there's a solid idea and a solid entrepreneur here. One of the things that's happened with sort of mainstream venture capital is the goalposts have been moved. There were years and years and years where all that was rewarded was aggressive growth. All we care about is growth. Doesn't matter. Who cares about profitability? And then all of a sudden, music stopped, musical chairs. Now all we care about is cash flow positive and profitability. How unfair.
Right? I mean, you and I will both have lived through this in the late 90s, right? It was the same thing, right?
Yes.
And I remember a very famous venture capitalist, Fred, I'm blocking on his last name now, but he was saying, yeah, I mean, I was suckered into this excessive optimism, but look at all the infrastructure that got built as a result of it, right? I mean, there were good things that came out of it, but we saw the same turn, right? I mean, I was teaching at the business school at that time, and we had a running joke, which is, oh, B2B, back to business, B2C, back to consulting, back to banking, back to consulting, because all the business school students for that sort of 1998, 99 period, they were all leaving to go join these heady startups. Right. And it all blew up, right?
Yes, exactly. No, and so there are these trends. We counsel our entrepreneurs. We say, look, think about values alignment on your cap table. Because the moment things get rough in an impact company and you've got mainstream investors, they say, give up the impact. Just focus on making money. And so if it's not firmly embedded, as it is with our companies, it's easy to strip it off. It's why we insist on it being baked into the core business. And we also talk to them about, don't take the highest valuation, because you're setting yourself up to have to meet this high growth trajectory. And maybe things are going to change. Maybe you're going to learn some interesting things from your customers along the way, and you're not going to want to grow that quickly forever.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the other thing that I find, I guess it's the nature of the beast in some ways, but you can have a great business which throws off enough money for you to live a comfortable life and pay people well and offer opportunities. I mean, there's lots of things you can do that are very wonderful in human life terms that would not turn the head of a typical venture capitalist, and I've always found that to be kind of what don't you really want the mom and pop store on Main Street doing well? I mean, like, why is that not a legitimate business is always the sort of puzzle that's been at the back of my head.
Well, we get approached by a lot of entrepreneurs where I say, look, I don't know that you're really a venture scale business. I don't know, it's your choice. What we try to do is give our entrepreneurs information and empower them to make their own decisions. But there are many that I've said, you know what? Don't you want to own your own business? If you want to own your own business, venture capital is not the way to go. Because if you're lucky and you have a big exit, you're going to, at that point, own somewhere between 5 and 10% of your company. Mm-hmm. And many of the business plans we see, it's really, you know what? You ought to be looking for debt. You ought to be looking for somebody to finance your receivables so you get to own your whole business. And there's some glamour attached with venture capital, but it's not the right model for many, many businesses.
So where do you hope it evolves to?
Well, I hope that venture capital.
And we're talking about this fantastic book, Closing the Equity Gap, Creating Wealth and Fostering Justice in Startup Investing. Great book. I highly recommend it.
So much. Thank you. So where I hope the venture capital industry gets to is to understand that looking with an impact lens, looking at who benefits when it's broader communities benefit, that is not concessionary. You do not have to do a trade-off between financial returns and a business that does well by doing good. And a diversity lens, an impact lens, solving intractable problems are all possible at venture scale. But you've got to back entrepreneurs who understand that and know how to build it. And again, I think we really ought to think about holding accountable the endowments, university endowments, foundation endowments, to invest consistent with mission.
Well, and pension funds. One of my colleagues is Rebecca Henderson, and at Harvard, and she wrote a wonderful book about reimagining capitalism. And one of the points she makes is that for many of the incentives in our sort of the world of finance, that many of those incentives are actually out of alignment with the true incentives of the money that they're managing, right? So the money that they're managing needs to last 70 years. The trades that they're engaging in are, 6 month, 9 month, whatever kind of things.
Right. That's right. Looking at how somebody's going to retire in 20 or 50 years from now is not at all consistent with looking at this quarter's earnings.
Exactly. Well, and the other thing that I think you and I sing from the same hymn book here is this quarter's earnings are a lagging indicator. They're the result of something you did 8 quarters ago, 10 quarters ago, 15 quarters ago. And so it's kind of a stupid conversation to say, wow, that was a great quarter. You should have been saying, hey, you're setting yourself up for a great quarter 2 years from now. It's just the wrong conversation, right?
Yes, right. A long-term view is what we need for people, for the planet, for business. We really need to think about what are the long-term implications of decisions we're making.
I love that. I just love that. Well, I could talk to you forever, but I asked for an hour, so our time's just about up. In the chat, you've got information about how to find out more. The book, as I said, Closing the Equity Gap, just out. It's a great book full of fun stories and sort of intriguing ideas. And what I love about it is the proof point. You don't have to sell your soul to have a comfortable financial life, And I think way too few people have gotten that message. So thank you so much for all that you've done.
Well, thank you. It's my pleasure. And I really appreciate the opportunity.
And we will be in touch because I've got some ideas for you, but that's a separate conversation. Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a great weekend.